I told you I was at home, Marcus responded, trying to steady his voice. I wasn't anywhere near the robbery. You've got the wrong guy. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Marcus with a cold gaze, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. It felt like a game to him, a power struggle in which Marcus was already losing. It was as though the officer had decided Marcus was guilty before they even started, and no amount of explaining would change that. The door to the room opened with a creak, and for a split second, Marcus thought he was about to be taken somewhere else. But instead of another officer, a figure stepped inside that made his stomach lurch. A senior officer, dressed in crisp uniform, walked in, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The junior officer turned, standing to attention. "Sir, this is the suspect," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of pride and defensiveness. He gestured toward Marcus, his finger pointed accusingly. The senior officer paused, his gaze sweeping over Marcus as he assessed the situation. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over him. There was something about the way the senior officer looked at him that made the air thick with tension. It was as if he was trying to piece something together, something that wasn't right. The senior officer's eyes narrowed, not at Marcus but at the junior officer. There was a flicker of recognition there, something that seemed to unsettle the younger officer. The senior officer's posture straightened as he focused entirely on the boy in front of him. Marcus met his gaze, trying to read him, to understand whether he was here to help or just another cog in the system that had already condemned him. "You're sure about this?" the senior officer asked, his voice even but laced with suspicion. The junior officer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I've got the guy who was near the store just before the robbery happened. He fits the description." The senior officer's eyes flicked back to Marcus, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw something like recognition in the senior officer's face. He studied Marcus for a long beat before speaking again. "Why don't you tell me your side of the story, son?" he asked, his tone much softer, more genuine than the junior officer's. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. It was like a lifeline thrown in the middle of a storm. He grasped for it, finally feeling like someone might actually be willing to listen. "I wasn't near the store," Marcus began, his voice steadier now. "I was out running just like I always do. I had nothing to do with the robbery. I don't even know what you're talking about." "You've got the wrong person." The senior officer didn't immediately respond. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the edge of the table. The tension in the room seemed to evaporate slightly as he listened, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The junior officer, growing impatient, stepped forward. "We've already been over this," he said. "He's the guy. I'm telling you, I saw him outside. He's guilty." But as the junior officer spoke, the senior officer's eyes widened slightly, the realization hitting him like a sudden wave. He looked at Marcus again, his brow furrowing in confusion. It was as if something had clicked into place, a piece of a puzzle that hadn't been visible before. The senior officer's voice was calm but direct. "You said you were just running. Where exactly were you when you passed the store?" "I was near the park," Marcus said quickly, trying to think back to exactly where he had been. "I wasn't even close to the store. It was a few blocks away." The senior officer stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He turned to the junior officer, his expression now one of clear disapproval. "That's enough," he said firmly. The junior officer froze, his eyes wide as he looked from his superior to Marcus. The senior officer didn't give him a chance to speak. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "This boy is not a thief. He wasn't anywhere near that store." The words hit Marcus like a blast of cold air. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The relief flooded through him, but it didn't fully register. He had been so sure that nothing could change, that he was trapped in this nightmare. And now, finally, someone had seen the truth. The junior officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face went pale, his earlier confidence crumbling into panic. But he stammered, unable to form a coherent response. The senior officer shook his head. No, this ends now. You've treated this boy like a criminal based on nothing more than assumptions, and you've wrongfully accused him of something he didn't do. Marcus felt the rush of emotions hit him all at once: relief, disbelief, and anger. Anger at how quickly things had escalated, at how easily the system had assumed he was guilty, and a quiet sadness that no matter how this ended, he would never forget the way the officer had looked at him, as if his innocence didn't matter at all. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Marcus sat frozen, his mind still grappling with the words of the senior officer. His body was still on edge, every muscle tense, as though it was preparing for another round of interrogation. But this time it wasn't coming. The junior officer, once so confident, now stood with his head hung low, his face drained of color. He could barely meet anyone's eyes as he processed the gravity of the situation. Marcus could see the guilt and fear slowly consuming him, but he didn't feel any sympathy. He'd just been a pawn in the officer's game. His life reduced to a set of assumptions, prejudices, and a twisted sense of power. The senior officer, seeing that the junior officer wasn't about to offer any explanation, spoke again, his voice heavy with authority. You've made a huge mistake, and now you'll answer for it. This is unacceptable. His words rang out like a decree, leaving the junior officer no room to escape the consequences. The officer's back was to Marcus, but he could hear the junior officer's stammered excuses in the air, each one weaker than the last. He could practically feel the junior officer's desperation to avoid the fallout of his actions. "Sir, I didn't mean," the junior officer began, but the senior officer interrupted with a sharp wave of his hand. "I'm not interested in your excuses. You should have known better. You've got a job to do, and instead you chose to follow your own biases. I'll deal with you shortly." Marcus couldn't help but watch as the junior officer, who had once towered over him with confidence, now stood completely defeated. The shift was almost surreal. A part of him wanted to speak out, to tell the officer that it wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal, not just of him, but of everything the badge was supposed to represent. But before he could think of saying anything, the door to the interrogation room opened once more, and this time it wasn't another officer. It was the figure Marcus had least expected. His father, the police chief. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. He'd been so consumed by the events of the past hour, so lost in the injustice of it all, that he hadn't even realized his father was on his way. The police chief walked in, his presence commanding the room without a word. His eyes immediately locked on Marcus, taking in the sight of his son, disheveled, tear-streaked, and clearly shaken. "Marcus," the chief said, his voice low and steady, but tinged with an unmistakable concern. He quickly approached Marcus, kneeling down to his eye level. For a moment, everything else in the room seemed to fade away. There was only the connection between father and son, the silent understanding that passed between them. It was the first time that day that Marcus felt any kind of warmth, any sense of safety. His father placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this," he whispered, his voice laced with regret. "This never should have happened. I'll make sure justice is served." The words felt like a balm to Marcus' frayed nerves. They didn't erase the fear, the humiliation, or the anger that still burned in his chest, but they gave him something to hold on to. His father was here now. And whatever happened, Marcus knew he wouldn't be alone in facing this. The senior officer, who had remained standing in the background, now turned to the police chief. "Sir, I've already informed the junior officer of the situation," he said, his voice firm. "We'll be taking the necessary steps to address this. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The chief gave a sharp nod, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "See to it that the matter is handled properly. And make sure the officer understands the consequences of his actions." His behavior was unacceptable. The senior officer hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Understood, sir." Marcus felt a strange sense of relief wash over him as the senior officer moved to the door, his words leaving a lingering sense of finality in the air. It was done. The truth had come out, and the junior officer was facing the consequences of his actions. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Turning back to Marcus, the chief stood up and offered his hand. Marcus hesitated for a second before taking it, his grip strong despite the exhaustion still weighing heavily on him. "I'm proud of you," the chief said, his voice full of pride and sorrow in equal measure. "You stayed strong, even when things seemed impossible." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He hadn't felt proud of himself in a long time. All he had felt was fear and confusion, unsure of how the situation would end. But now, with his father by his side, he began to understand that standing up to injustice wasn't just about fighting back. It was about finding the courage to hold on to your dignity, even when the world tried to take it from you. The weight of the day's events still clung to Marcus like a thick fog as he sat in the quiet room, his father beside him. The adrenaline that had fueled him during the confrontation with the junior officer had drained away, leaving a deep exhaustion in its place. He was grateful for his father's presence, but even more so for the promise of action that came with it. The sense of justice that Marcus had been desperately searching for was now beginning to take shape, but there was still so much to be done. The chief had stayed with Marcus for a while longer after the junior officer had been escorted out of the room. They spoke in hushed tones, Marcus sharing the details of what had transpired, every moment feeling like a weight he could finally put down. But as the conversation went on, it became clear that the situation wasn't going to end here. Not just for the junior officer but for the system as a whole. "My son should never have been treated this way," the chief had said, his voice thick with frustration as he stood to pace the small room. "I can't let this go. Not just because you're my son, Marcus, but because this is a failure of everything we stand for." Marcus could see the anger in his father's eyes, an anger that was not just for him but for the corruption and bias that had nearly ruined his life. His father had always been a strong man, a pillar of authority in their community. But in that moment, Marcus saw the vulnerability in him, the pain of realizing how deep the rot ran within the system he had dedicated his life to. "I'll make sure the right people know what happened," the chief continued, more to himself than to Marcus. "We can't let this be swept under the rug. The officer's actions can't go unpunished." Marcus couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. He'd seen enough to know that the system was far from perfect, but the fact that his father was willing to stand up for him, to challenge the very system he had helped build, meant everything. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like maybe things could change. Maybe things didn't have to stay broken. As they stood to leave the station, the chief's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced down, his expression hardening as he read the message before slipping the phone back into his pocket. "It's the internal investigation team," the chief said, his voice tight. "They want to talk to you. They'll want to know everything, every detail." Marcus nodded, already bracing for the next round of questions. He had already gone through so much, had been dragged through the mud by the junior officer's assumptions and prejudice, and now it seemed the official investigation was about to begin. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that he would have to relive every moment of the humiliation in order to ensure that the officer was held accountable. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Not like before. There was a fire in him now, a resolve that hadn't been there at the beginning of this nightmare. He wasn't just going to let it go. He wasn't going to let that officer walk away without facing the consequences. They left the station together, the chief's hand on Marcus' shoulder, a silent gesture of support. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Marcus felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't the crushing burden of injustice that had threatened to destroy him. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of standing up for what was right. The chief turned to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "We'll get through this, son," he said quietly. "You've got a long road ahead of you, but I'll be by your side every step of the way." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, the sting of unshed tears threatening to break through. "Thanks, Dad," he managed to say, his voice thick. It was all he could manage. The chief nodded, his expression resolute. "Let's make sure no one else goes through what you did." As they walked together into the night, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, a fight for fairness, for accountability, for the people who had been overlooked, mistreated, or unjustly accused. And for the first time he felt like he had a chance to make a difference. The investigation moved quickly after that night. The junior officer was placed on administrative leave, and an internal review was launched to assess the full scope of his actions. For the first time, Marcus felt like the system was working the way it was supposed to, that it wasn't just about protecting its own, but about holding everyone accountable, no matter their rank or position. But even as the wheels of justice began to turn, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep inside him. The damage had already been done. He had been subjected to a kind of treatment no one should ever endure, and even though he knew the officer would face consequences, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many others had suffered the same fate. How many people had been targeted simply because of the color of their skin, their economic status, or their perceived worth. The night after the investigation began, Marcus stayed up late, his mind racing as he thought about everything that had transpired. His phone buzzed with a message from his father. "The officer's been suspended, but we still have a long way to go. I need you to testify." Marcus took a deep breath. He knew what this meant. It meant he would have to stand before everyone, the department, the board, maybe even the public, and relive the humiliation. But he couldn't back down now. Not after everything. He couldn't let this be a story that faded into the background. It had to be a story that spurred change. The following week, the hearing took place. Marcus was called in to testify, and as he sat in the hot seat before the panel, he felt every pair of eyes on him. But unlike before, when he had been filled with fear and uncertainty, he was calm now. Strong. He spoke the truth, detailing everything that had happened, the officer's aggressive behavior, the accusations, the pain he had endured. He spoke about the fear, the anger, and the helplessness, but he also spoke about the hope he now had, thanks to his father's unwavering support. When it was over, the panel announced that the junior officer's actions were inexcusable. His termination was finalized, and he would face further scrutiny for his treatment of Marcus. But even as the decision was made, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The real change would come only when the system itself was held accountable. When the prejudice and bias that had influenced the officer's actions were rooted out, one by one. As he left the hearing, his father beside him, Marcus realized that he had taken the first step toward something greater. He had stood up for himself, for justice, and for the countless others who had been wronged by those who were supposed to protect them. His journey wasn't over, but it had begun in the most important way possible. In the weeks that followed, the chief kept his promise. He worked tirelessly to overhaul the department's policies, implementing training programs focused on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward a better system, one where the officers who wore the badge did so with honor, not prejudice. Marcus kept pushing forward too. He spoke out in community meetings, in front of local organizations, and to anyone who would listen. He shared his story not for sympathy but for change. Every time he spoke, he saw the faces of others who had been hurt, others who had endured the same injustices, and it only fueled his resolve. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the battle wasn't won in a single night, or with a single testimony. But he also knew this. If he could make even one person understand the power of standing up for what's right, then he had done something worth fighting for. And as he walked beside his father through the streets of their city, Marcus finally understood what it meant to fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for the future, for the ones who would come after, who wouldn't have to endure what he had. They were a long way from the end of this story, but it was a start. And for Marcus, that was all he needed. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the air was still cool from the night. Marcus had just finished his morning run, his breath steady as he jogged down the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The rhythmic thud of his feet on the pavement mixed with the soft hum of his earbuds, a podcast keeping him company. He'd learned to take these early mornings in stride. No distractions, no worries, just the silence that came with the world still half asleep. As he passed the corner store, he slowed down, wiping the sweat from his brow, ready to head back home. He could already hear his daughter's laughter from the kitchen, imagining her running circles around his wife, trying to get ready for school. It was supposed to be a normal morning. Then it all went wrong. A siren wailed behind him. Marcus didn't pay it much mind at first. It was early, maybe someone had made a wrong turn. But the siren grew louder, and then the screech of tires. His heart dropped. He glanced over his shoulder, just in time to see 2 police cars whip into view, their flashing lights bathing the quiet street in garish red and blue. Before Marcus could react, hands grabbed him from behind. The officer slammed him face first into the side of a parked car, pressing his arms behind his back so forcefully that the pain shot through his shoulders like a jolt of electricity. His breath caught in his chest as the officer snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. "What the hell?" Marcus gasped, trying to catch his breath. "What is this about?" "Shut up," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp. "You're under arrest for the robbery at the corner store." Marcus felt his world spin. "Robbery? I don't know anything about a robbery." "Shut your mouth," the officer growled, twisting Marcus's arm harder. "You're coming with us." As the junior officer forced Marcus into the back of the patrol car, he struggled, every muscle in his body stiff with confusion and disbelief. The officer's partner leaned in, eyes cold and dismissive. "You fit the description, buddy," he said. "We know what you're about." Marcus blinked, his head spinning. "What description?" "I was just..." The door slammed shut, and the car roared to life. The windows were rolled up tight, the air suffocating. He couldn't understand how this was happening. One moment he was jogging down his block and the next he was being hauled off like a criminal. The sirens wailing in the background were the only sound he could hear as the car drove down the street. His phone, left on the sidewalk where it had fallen during the arrest, lay out of reach. The ride to the station was an agonizing blur. Marcus didn't know how long it lasted, minutes, maybe hours. But the oppressive silence inside the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio, made his mind spin faster than it should have. Every moment felt heavier than the last, each second pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't escape. When they finally arrived, the officers didn't waste any time. One of them yanked him out of the car with a rough grip on his arm, pulling him forward toward the station doors. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as they dragged him inside. His head was spinning from the suddenness of it all, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had to be mistaken, right? This had to be some kind of error. He hadn't done anything wrong. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered overhead as they shoved him down a narrow hallway. The smell of stale coffee and the distant murmur of other officers filled the air, but it didn't feel like the usual noise of his neighborhood. It felt wrong. It was sterile, clinical, like everything here was designed to remind him that he wasn't a person anymore. He was a suspect. They pushed open a door that led into a small, dimly lit room. Marcus was too disoriented to take in the details at first. The worn chair in the middle of the room, the clock ticking on the wall, the sterile smell of the place. It wasn't until he was roughly shoved into the chair that he realized the reality of the situation. He was alone, and there was no one here to help him. The officer who'd been silent for most of the ride leaned forward, his face a mask of annoyance. He didn't say a word but moved to a table, picking up a notebook and pen. He set it down hard on the table, as if the sound alone would intimidate Marcus. "Start talking," the officer barked. Marcus' throat went dry. His hands were still trembling, his mind still racing to understand how any of this had happened. "I don't know what this is about," he said, his voice coming out hoarse. I haven't stolen anything. I'm not involved in any robbery. The officer didn't respond. He just stared at Marcus, his eyes cold and unfeeling, like they were looking through him rather than at him. You've got the wrong guy, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. I was just jogging. I live down the street. I don't know what you're talking about. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. You fit the description of the suspect. That's all we need. Marcus' stomach churned. It wasn't supposed to be this way. His heart pounded in his chest as the officer continued to eye him, his fingers drumming on the desk. You were seen near the store, the officer continued. You were there just before the robbery happened. What were you doing, huh? Marcus shook his head. I wasn't near the store. I was. Liar, the officer cut him off, his voice rising. You've got a record. We know your type. He sneered as he said it, the contempt evident in his tone. Marcus felt a jolt of frustration. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't even close to the store. He had been out for a run just like he always did. But the more he tried to explain, the more the officer cut him off, drowning out his words with accusations, assumptions, and half-formed conclusions. His mind raced, trying to think of some way to get through to this man, but the officer wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in hearing the truth. As the interrogation continued, Marcus could feel his pulse rising, his thoughts spinning. He hadn't been this scared in a long time, but it wasn't just fear that gripped him. It was the sickening realization that the officer didn't care about the truth. He didn't care that Marcus was innocent. This was something deeper. This was about power, about suspicion, about being judged for something beyond his control, something as simple as the color of his skin. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Marcus saw the disdain growing. He could feel it, even if the officer didn't speak it aloud. This wasn't about the robbery. This was about the assumption that Marcus was guilty just because he was there. And with that realization, Marcus' chest tightened. He wasn't sure how he was going to get out of this, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about the robbery. This was about a whole system stacked against him. Time seemed to stretch in the interrogation room. Marcus could feel his body growing more rigid with every minute that passed. His mind raced with thoughts of how to prove his innocence, but nothing felt right. Every time he opened his mouth, the officer would dismiss him, his words sharp and cutting. The officer's eyes never softened. His expression locked in a mask of indifference and suspicion. Where were you last night? The officer demanded, his voice rising slightly. What's your alibi?